Hello and welcome to Buy Africa, the show where we focus on investment opportunities around the continent. I'm Tsepo Mudiba, and thanks for joining me. Tonight, I'm joined by Musa Nyamande, Head of Operations in Technology at Chronology. Musa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tsepo. Thanks for having me here.
We're speaking about an interesting subject today, crowdfunding, something we haven't spoken about on the show. Let's start with unpacking what exactly is crowdfunding.
Very interesting concept, but certainly nothing new.
Right.
Crowdfunding is essentially a way to get a group of funds or a collection of funds from a crowd of people,
right,
instead of getting it from one person.
And not necessarily people, so it could be a crowd of businesses, it could be broader than that. How does, I guess in terms of mechanics, how does that work? Who regulates it? How do you decide what sort of interest rate is charged? What do the underlying funders earn?
Yeah, if you look at it, it's quite interesting that it's a bit regulated, but not much.
Right.
So it could be a group of individuals, it could be a group of businesses, but essentially crowdfunding operates on a platform.
Right.
So on that platform, a crowd of funders come through with investments, and they pool those investments, right? Let's say you come in with a certain amount of money, I come in with a certain amount of money. Together, collectively, we put together a pool of money, and it's up to the investment committee on the platform or up to us as investors which businesses or which ventures we invest in.
Right.
And it's also up to us to agree on rates or returns and interest rates that we charge for those investments that we make. So one part of it is we get to decide how much we charge for the capital that we're putting onto the platform and the people that are using it, and or we could negotiate with the people who are borrowing the money from us.
Right. So is the onus on the end investors as a collective or the platform to assess things like credit risk?
So you get formal crowdfunding and then informal crowdfunding. The more formal it is, the more structure there is on the platform. So the platform could then dictate what the credit scoring requirements are for the investors that are coming in, or even the lenders or the borrowers, the people who are getting the investment. Also, the more formal the platform is, or the more formal the market is, then you find that there's more regulation in that market. So you find that traditional or institutional financing is regulated very much by banking institutions and legislation, but you find that crowdfunding in the way that it is today, which is seen as a new practice, is not so regulated, except for in the much more mature markets. So in a market where crowdfunding is operated for 5-10 years, for instance, you'd find a lot more regulation there than there is in a market where crowdfunding is operated formally for 1 year.
Okay, so for the funders, I sort of get, I guess the pursuit is to make money. What is the incentive for those businesses or individuals to access these platforms or crowdfunding to tap into funding? Is it because they can't get funding elsewhere, or is it too expensive elsewhere?
What you find is exactly like you said. Most of the time, people choose alternative financing methods because traditional financing methods have high barriers to entry, high requirements, and then they find that if they don't meet those requirements, the only other alternative is not to get the financing, and then they just don't pursue the business venture. So since there are these alternative financing methods, they then say, okay, cool, since the traditional financing route didn't work, let's try this one, which has lower requirements. It might mean that we pay a higher interest rate or higher returns, but the most important thing is for them to actually land the funding.
Okay. I think I get it.
Yeah.
In terms of the overall then market within the continent, how has crowdfunding gained traction?
You see me pausing like this because I'm trying to piece all the puzzle pieces together in my mind. Over the past year or so, at our organization, at Chronology, we've looked into crowdfunding technology quite extensively. Which is to say that crowdfunding has matured quite aggressively in the past 12 months.
Right.
Before then, not so much. There were some players, but maybe not so advanced technologically and operationally as well.
Right.
So we're seeing it taking off. In South Africa, there's quite a lot of activity and traction. We're seeing some players operating the space, some of them informally. So in Zimbabwe, in Harare, and in areas like Gweru, you find people operating it informally. They give microloans to businesses,
right.
And they might put together the capital for those loans using a crowd. So they might crowdsource the funds.
Sure.
In areas like Kenya, I've read that it's quite established. So one case is an area that an institution was formed to fund businesses run by women.
Right.
And these were crowdfunded loans. So we're seeing quite a lot of traction picking up on the African continent. If we were to compare it to other markets, like the market in the UK or the market in the US, I'd say the African market throughout the continent is not as mature as those markets operationally and technologically.
Right.
Not to say that it's been operating there for longer than it's been on the continent.
One of the trends that we've seen, I guess for many a year on the continent, is certainly that corporates and small businesses are particularly reluctant to enter traditional capital raising markets like debt capital markets and things like that. They tend to lean on bank financing. Is this or is that trend then potentially an opportunity for crowdfunding platforms to tap into this source of providing capital?
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. It does present an opportunity. I agree. The traditional corporations and bigger businesses, from what I've seen, they tend to prefer traditional financing methods. Perhaps it's what's known and it's also what's understood.
Right.
What you find is that new methods of financing may not be known and may not be understood as well. So it's not as easy to get them off the ground. If you're running a multinational enterprise and you need to raise $100 million for whatever reason, raising that capital has to meet certain requirements within the organization before you even start talking to a financing organization.
Right.
So because of those rules that are imposed by the corporate governance frameworks, they find that there isn't much of a match or an alignment between the corporate governance frameworks and this new way of raising funds, which is crowdfunding. So it definitely does present an opportunity if the crowdfunding platforms become more organized and more structured, such that they meet the requirements for the big corporations.
Just to understand, I guess you touched a little bit about the informal crowdfunding that's happening in Zimbabwe as an example, and a little bit more formalized in a market like Kenya. What drives that? What drives the demand for crowdfunding? Is it? Actually, let me leave it to you to answer. What drives that? And I'm trying to understand really then where are the opportunities on the continent for this to grow quite aggressively.
Where I'll start is by saying, let's assume that demand for funding is constant throughout every market. So if somebody wants to start a business, they're going to need financing, right? Whether it's in SA, in the US, in Australia, Singapore, Kenya, Ghana, anywhere, right? Let's assume that the demand for funding is constant. What you find is that the businesses operating in that market have different channels to that funding. And those different channels have different barriers and requirements. And you find that the ones where the barriers are the lowest, or where it's easier to land that funding, that happens more, right? So the uptake for that crowdfunding is a lot higher. So you could say in Kenya, because it's more structured and organized, there's a lower barrier to accessing those funds. In a place like Zimbabwe, where the operations are not that mature, right, from what I've heard, you find that there are higher barriers to accessing that funding. So you find that fewer people then take up these crowdfunding opportunities.
Right.
So I'd say one could say that that's where the opportunity exists. If you structure it more and you make it more organized, then all the people who need funding, all the people where there's a demand for funding, you can then meet that with supply.
So in essence, you're likely to see a greater pace of growth of crowdfunding initiatives in markets that are a little bit more developed and have a little bit more sophistication around the structure of the regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so from that, I'm assuming then, the East African bloc, the likes of Kenya, you've touched on Rwanda,
mm-hmm.
Are probably more likely to have a faster uptick than elsewhere in the continent.
Yes.
Okay.
And to touch on that a little bit, what we're seeing in the Eastern Bloc is quite a strong development in fintech,
right,
in general, in financial technology. So crowdfunding may be one element of it, but we're seeing not only in Kenya, in Rwanda as well, there are quite a number of institutions who are looking to take up financial technology and introduce it into their operations to bring more efficiencies and development.
What role does technology play in, I guess, facilitating crowdfunding?
Technology is an enabler.
Right.
So let's say structurally, or if you look at the process, right, the process might be very sophisticated and very involved. Technology enables that process to be simpler. So technology isn't necessarily the thing that makes the process happen.
Right.
It just simplifies and streamlines the process. So you get results with less effort.
Right. So you don't necessarily need to have a technological edge to see a greater uptick in crowdfunding.
It helps to have a technological edge.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Let's leave it there.
Yeah.
Thanks to my guest, Musa Nyamande, Head of Operations and Technology at Chronology. That's all from Buy Africa this week. Remember to follow me on Twitter. That's @Mudiba_Tepo. And send us your thoughts about the show using the hashtag BuyAfrica. From myself and the team, goodbye.